Hello, and welcome to my lecture on the topic of computational neuroscience. Computational neuroscience is the study of the theory and the mathematics of animal intelligence. Broadly speaking, the goal is to understand the fundamental nature of animal intelligence. How are animals able to do such intelligent things? How does intelligence work? We will investigate how the brain represents information and how the brain manipulates information to solve specific problems. But before we dive into all of the theory about how the brain works, we need to understand the physical, biological manifestation of these mathematical equations. So without further ado, let's dive into the high school science that I'm sure you all remember, but in case you don't, I'm going to refresh your memory. So if this is material that you've already covered, then feel free to skip ahead. Okay, let's begin. This is a diagram of a neuron showing the major parts of the neuron. At the center, we have the soma, that's the cell body of the neuron. The dendrites and the axon are two trees that sprout out of the neuron. These are branching structures. They're composed of very thin tubes, and they branch out in every which way. And each of these tubes is electrically conductive. This is a diagram showing the electrical conductivity within the neuron. It's composed of these tubes, and I've drawn the tube, a single tube on the board. And the tube is full of ions. The ions, represented by minuses and pluses, these are chemicals that have an electric charge. And the ions can move around within the neuron and within the medium that the neuron is in, within the fluid that the neuron lives in. And they can also pass through the ion channels. I've drawn the ion channels as these yellow dots. The ions are pushed through the channels by osmotic pressure. So if there's a lot of ions outside it, then the osmotic pressure will push them in, or vice versa, it can also push them out. And when they push through the ion channels, they carry their charge with them, and this is a form of electric current. The ions within the neuron can also push through the length of the neuron to transmit electricity through the dendritic tree and through the axons. Now, the ions that the neurons work with, typically neurons are full of these four ions. There are some other ions, but these are the four primary ions that are inside of neurons: sodium, potassium, chlorine, and finally calcium. And these ions have different charges and they have different chemical properties. Now I'm going to discuss the ion channels that allow the ions into and out of the neuron. These ion channels are large protein structures, and they have a hole in the center of the protein that allows ions through the membrane. The ion channels are embedded into the membrane, and they can open up to let the ions through, or they can close to prevent ions from going through. And these ion channels are very elaborate. They can do some very complex things, and there's about 1,000 different types of ion channels in the brain. So some more details about the ion channels that you should know are that they're selective in terms of what they allow to pass through and under what circumstances. Most ion channels are selective based on the type of ion, as in they only let one or two types of ions through. They don't just let anything through. And they're selective on the direction of the ion. Many of these channels will only let ions into the neuron, and many of them will only let ions out of the neuron. The voltage across the cell membrane can alter how the ion channel works. Some ion channels will close or open depending on what the voltage is across the membrane of the neuron. And finally, chemical reactions can alter how the ion channels work. Chemicals can bind to the ion channels to force them to open up, or chemicals can bind to them, different chemicals can bind to them to cause them to close up. So, as we can see, neurons are electrically active, and these mechanisms are embedded throughout the entire neuron. So the entire neuron is an electrical circuit. Not only is the neuron electrically active, but the electricity is transmitted through ions. and these ions are chemically active. In particular, calcium participates in many different chemical reactions. Now let's discuss the basic mechanism of information transmission within a neuron. Typically, the voltage across the membrane of a neuron is about minus 70 millivolts. That means that there's a lot of negative ions inside of the neuron and a lot of more positive ions outside of the neuron. This happens because there are pumps embedded inside of the membrane of the neuron that continually pump negative ions into the neuron and continually pump positive ions out of the neuron. And that drives the voltage to about minus 70 millivolts. But sometimes ion channels will open up and they'll let a bunch of positive ions into the neuron. And when the voltage across the membrane reaches something called the activation threshold, then the neuron emits an action potential. This is a spike in voltage. A bunch of positive ions flood into the neuron, and then when the voltage across the cell membrane gets to about 40 millivolts, a different set of ion channels opens up and allows negative ions into the neuron. And then that drives the voltage very low again. And so you have this characteristic spike in voltage. It propagates throughout the entire neuron. And as it propagates, this characteristic spike of voltage changes all of the electrical and chemical properties of the neuron for a very brief moment in time. The duration of the action potential is typically about 2 milliseconds. So for about 2 milliseconds, the entire neuron has gone from being negatively voltaged to positive voltage. And there are many different chemical reactions that can detect this flip in the polarity of the neuron, and they can do all sorts of interesting things when this happens. And then after the action potential, there's a period of about 5 to 10 milliseconds where the voltage in the neuron has been driven into a very negative state. This is known as the after hyperpolarization. And what this does is it prevents the neuron from firing another action potential for a few milliseconds. These action potentials are all or nothing events. They're essentially a binary pulse of electricity. And finally, let's discuss synapses. Synapses are connections between neurons. They allow electricity to pass from an axon into a dendrite. When an action potential propagates through an axon, it causes chemical reactions to happen in the synapse, and that allows electricity to pass from the axon into the dendrite. There's a lot of chemistry happening inside of the synapse, and it's quite a bit more complicated than what I just described. But the gist of it is that electricity goes from the axon into the next dendrite. And then this next dendrite can cause the next neuron to emit an action potential, which can then further propagate throughout the brain. All of these neurons in the brain are connected to each other in recurrent loops through synapses. Okay, let's summarize what we've learned so far. Chemical reactions are happening everywhere in the brain, and chemical reactions can implement complex logical functions. Proteins in particular can do some very complicated and elaborate things. Electricity is also everywhere in the brain. Electricity enables fast communication within each neuron. I want to emphasize that action potentials are ideal for transmitting information over long distances. Action potentials propagate very quickly and reliably. Once an action potential has started, it always finishes propagating throughout the entire axon. Action potentials are also easy to detect because they briefly flip the polarity of the neuron's membrane, and the things that detect action potentials only care about this flip in the polarity. They don't care about the exact voltages involved, so there's less room for inaccuracy. Action potentials are essentially a binary form of information transmission. They're not analog. Networks of neurons form loops of recurrent activity. The way this works is that action potentials travel through the axons, They activate the synapses, which activates the dendrites, and finally that activates the soma of the neurons, which can initiate more action potentials. These loops of recurrent activity are constantly cascading throughout the entire brain. The brain is constantly active. And finally, if this stuff excites you and you want to learn more, I highly recommend reading Wikipedia and its cousin Scholarpedia. Wikipedia is an amazing resource for gaining an introductory level of understanding about almost any topic you could want to learn about. I learned almost everything I know by reading Wikipedia. A nice feature of Wikipedia is that it has so many links that cross-reference related articles. I highly recommend clicking on those links, wander around and explore the topics until you find what interests you.